Thanks, Greg. Welcome, everybody. I'll launch straight into this. So there's three questions that I really have addressed in this work and I'd like to get through today. It's looking at cultivated Leucaena across Northern Australia, so not the wild stuff. Three questions here. How much Leucaena is there, cultivated Leucaena in Northern Australia? We also looked at where is it viable in Northern Australia, so mapping its potential use range. And then I'll cover off finally on that economics work that Fred Chudley did. Just as a side note here, you'll hear us all today refer to the Redlands variety of Leucaena. For those of you who don't know, and there'll be more detail later, Redlands is a variety of Leucaena that's been developed for the wetter areas of Queensland, areas with greater than 800 mils of rainfall. And that was because Leucaena historically has struggled in those areas because of an insect called psyllids, which tend to prey on Leucaena and make it difficult to manage there. So we'll be talking about both Redlands and other varieties today. Okay, so in terms of that first question, how much Leucaena is out there? We really looked at Queensland for this work mostly. The thing with Leucaena and surveying is it's actually pretty easy to spot in high resolution imagery, and that's because it tends to be planted with these wide interrows, 5 to 12 meters, and often with double drills. So when you look at the imagery, it's pretty easy to see where it is. And in 2018, that study that Greg referred to earlier, we published a study of the heartland of Leucaena in Australia and Queensland, and that's if you can see my mouse there, that's from Mackay South. So we're looking at the Fitzroy region here, which is the heartland of the heartland, if you like. And that area south, there's about 350,000 square kilometres of land there. And we looked at a little over 12,500 sites, 10 hectare sites in the imagery, and looked at whether we can see that Leucaena in there. And where we did, measured how much was there. And from that, with a little maths, you can get an estimate of how much cultivated Leucaena there is. And our estimate from that, for that whole area, was somewhere between 900 and 1,550 square kilometres. The study I'm talking about today, though, looked at how do we expand on this. And we did that like so. So this is, if you can see my mouse, this is our old study area here, and we were able to extend the study area further north in this area B, and we were also able to resample area A. This was a part of our old sampling area where we were able to get new imagery, so effectively resample it at a later date. And what we found out from this was in area A, so this resampled area with about 4,700 sites we looked at, we estimated that there was somewhere between 210 and 480 square kilometres of Leucaena there. And because it was a resample, we were able to say that there's about 60 square kilometres of extra Leucaena in there since it was previously sampled about 5 years ago. So we've got a system there that can monitor changes in the overall crop. The area B up here, and this is tends to be, well, it's more tropical and generally wetter. This hadn't been sampled before, and we found very little Leucaena in there, and that of course reflects that history of not growing Leucaena where there's more rainfall because of psyllids. Our estimate for Leucaena coverage in this area in here was somewhere around 70 square kilometres, or 7,000 hectares. So not a whole lot, and most of that at that point in time was down here near the Fitzroy anyway. These black dots that you can see are the actual sites where we did find Leucaena. Okay, so some take-home messages from this. We would think in this area that we've looked at, there's somewhere between 1,000 and 1,700 square kilometres of cultivated Leucaena, and the Fitzroy region very much dominates that. There's very little at this point in time in the tropics, and that reflects that history. We didn't do sampling like this in the NT or WA or the rest of Queensland because of a lack of imagery that was available to us. But if I had to estimate, I would say that based on advice from experts in the field, there's certainly less than 2,000 square kilometres of Leucaena across Northern Australia. The second question I looked at was potential distribution. Where could it grow? How much? And what difference does that Redlands variety make to to that mapping and those estimates. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds here about how we did it, but to solve this problem, or try to solve it, we recruited 7 experts in Leucaena from across Australia, 2 from Western Australia, 2 from the Territory, and 3 from Queensland. And we got a lot of information from these people. We firstly asked them what they thought were the variables that were most important in determining a successful Leucaena crop in a grazing situation. And they nominated a bunch of variables that you can see listed down here. And we found the ones that we could spatialize, that were mapped across this area. And that's the list there that you see over here on the left, the variables they thought were important that we had mapping for. We also asked our experts how they thought we should cut up those important variables in a way that they would show on the landscape where those variables were optimal, viable, or not viable for cropping Leucaena. And they gave us various options for those. What you're looking at here is actually a screenshot from a spreadsheet that we gave each of our experts. So this was the tool they worked with to work out where they each thought in their state Leucaena could grow. And the way it works is they'll pick options here for each of these variables and how they're cut up, and they can use various combinations. And as they do, the mapping they see will change, and the classifications, viable, non-viable, and optimal, as will the coverage. So there's a simple example here. Let's say our expert with this spreadsheet decides that it's optimal for Leucaena to have more than 600 mils of rainfall, and it's only viable about 550, in which case they would put a mark in this box here. As I do that, you'll see the map change, and that yellow area down the bottom change as well with the hectare estimates there. See the map changes and the hectares. I'll just toggle that a couple of times. So they would work with a spreadsheet like this, and they could use combinations of variables to see how it all changed until they saw a distribution that made sense to them. And that's how we got their estimates of where it could grow. So 2 examples from 2 of our Queensland experts. This is one expert, and over here on the right, you can see these are the options that he chose in the table, and these are the hectares that he got for optimal, viable, and non-viable, and the mapping that he got. A little bit different to another expert, same again for Queensland, whose mapping looked like this. And you can see that's because this expert chose a different combination of variables, and they got different hectare values for these 3 classes. But what you can do with the input from your experts is you can basically average them, and you wind up with a heat map. And this just shows where we think that Leucaena is most viable, cultivated Leucaena, across Northern Australia based on that expert advice. And you can see here in Queensland, just one more thing to note with this map, these hatched areas here, cross-hatched areas, these are places with more than 800 mils of rain per year. And that's where we think if Leucaena is viable, it would be redlands rather than other varieties. But once you've got this map, the fun starts, and you can see your estimate of the square kilometres that's available, that's viable. And by viable, I mean both optimal and or viable, those 2 classes together, in the various jurisdictions. All right, so the conclusions we drew from this are as follows. So obviously with Queensland, it's got the lion's share of potential Leucaena cultivation areas. There's substantial areas in the Territory and some in WA. You can see there with the amount of redlands, it's about 20% of what's possible with the other varieties in drier areas, but redlands could significantly extend the distribution of other Leucaena varieties if it's going to work well in wetter areas. It's important to note too that the analysis that we did, and I do want to stress this, we looked at biological viability. So our numbers that we've got here don't take into account local weed, vegetation, leasehold, and other conditions that may be related to planting. But even saying that, if certainly with Queensland and possibly interstate, it doesn't look like space is going to be a limiting factor in terms of cultivating Leucaena and grazing land. And I think that raises two important points. If there's plenty of space, there's room there to employ practices and seek out locations where the weed risks associated with Leucaena are lowered. And for that, we've got the Leucaena Network's Code of Practice that targets that and works out that. So I'd refer anyone interested onto that. I'll also say that in terms of agencies, looking at the mapping we've done, it can help them to perhaps target where they try to promote or support Leucaena use in those more viable areas. Alrighty, last question, looking at the financial benefits at an industry level of cultivated Leucaena in Northern Australia. Again, this is the work of Fred Chudley, a long-standing and now retired DAF economist. Now, for the economics nerds out there, what Fred calculated was total net present value with a 5% discount. And this is only for new Leucaena cultivations. And he's looked at a period of 40 years, 2022 to 2061. Now, Fred himself said it was a pretty conservative analysis, and I want to highlight two assumptions before we get the results. And those assumptions are this. He assumed a pattern of adoption and then disadoption over that 40-year period. So up to somewhere around the middle of those 40 years, he expected the amount of new Leucaena plantings to keep rising, and then they would start to decline, the coverage to decline. And his idea there was that that's due to technology change. Industry moves on and there are better options than Leucaena. So he factored that into the analysis, you'll see. The other thing that he did was he assumed that the amount of new cultivations will accrue at a rate that reflects the history. So he assumes that it will peak in the next 40 years with an additional 1,900 or so square kilometres of plantings. And that reflects about the same amount that we've accrued over the previous 40 years that we know from our survey work. So that said, these are the values that he got for Northern Australia. So there's about 4 million for WA and the NT, and something close to 20 million for Queensland. Now that's not per year, that's total. And in Queensland, the red number there is for the redlands. So that's in those wetter areas. So, and it's about 25% of the Queensland benefit. So they're not big numbers there. I'll make a few points and then I'll sign off. This is my last slide, Greg. So in terms of the take-homes from the financial benefits, obviously Queensland has the lion's share of the Leucaena and stands to have the lion's shares of the potential returns at that industry level. The Redlands cultivar, we could see by the numbers there in Queensland, has substantial potential to increase that benefit if Redlands works well. As Fred said, his analysis was a conservative one, and he was very specific that the results can differ at property level. And he made the point when he spoke to me about it that if you've got the right resources on the property and the right management, you can make good returns out of cultivated Leucaena. The internal rate of return from some of the places that he's looked at in the Fitzroy, for example, can exceed 30%.
Right, thanks, Greg, and good afternoon, everybody. So today, as Greg mentioned, I'm going to talk about Leucaena from the perspective of North Queensland. And for those of you who are listening in other regions of Queensland or indeed the country, there should be still something worthwhile for you, whether you're in Billawheeler or Douglas Daly. So why this amalgam of North Queensland and Leucaena was that topical? As Terry's already talked about, the availability of the new Redlands, silver-resistant Redlands variety has removed one of the impediments to adoption of Leucaena in North Queensland. So prior to Redlands, as Terry said, the psyllid issue was a significant factor limiting uptake. So when Redlands came marching over the horizon in about 2018, we've seen, and by my numbers, these are rough, an increase in the area planted to Leucaena in North Queensland. And I'm talking about a region sort of north of Townsville and Charters Towers. So basically a tripling of area from around about 1,500 hectares up to about 4,500 hectares last year. Not all of that is redlands, some is other varieties. And I would say that this has also occurred at a time of relatively buoyant beef prices. Plantings have slowed down in the last year or two, and most of this area is just by several key growers. So the expansion hasn't been dramatic. I mean, that's coming off a pretty low base and the numbers are still pretty modest. So just talking about our experience and learnings from producers and trials that have been conducted with Leucaena in that period. As Greg mentioned, we had the perennial Liveweight gain trial. And that was established basically to test the worth of redlands to make sure the industry wasn't being sold a dud, that it would be grazed well by cattle in a field situation. So we set up a trial of about 61 hectares near Mount Garnet in North Queensland, and in an area where silage occur. And the idea was to see if redlands was up to the task, and would it in fact outperform another variety when silage came along. So there was 8 paddocks there. Half were planted to redlands, half were planted to undergraze. We grazed weaner steers on those paddocks. So each group was grazed for a minimum of 12 months. There were 3 separate cohorts over about a 4-year period. And within each group, half the animals grazed only redlands paddocks and the other half grazed only undergraze. At the end of that period in December 21, the Leucaena was getting quite tall there. So we cut it back, we let it regrow over the wet season. Then we, just as an exercise really, we introduced a group of heavyweight steers and grazed them through to slaughter weight just to see how they performed. And they were not grazed on redlands or undergraze specifically, they just had access to the whole paddock. They were rotated through paddocks on the site. So the results from grazing the weaner steers, 3 cohorts of weaner steers. So each pair of columns here represents each cohort, the first, second, and third cohorts. The orange bar represents the cover grazing the redlands, and the lighter coloured is the animals on the undergraze. And what we're measuring here is the average daily gain over a 12-month period. So the first thing we take home from this is we really didn't see any difference between redlands and undergraze. So that was reassuring. Redlands was readily accepted by cattle, and essentially the animals performed the same as they did on undergraze. The disappointing thing was that in that period, we didn't really have any significant silage pressure. So we weren't able to tease out any advantage from using the redlands. The other thing to take home from these results is that the live weight gains achieved were quite impressive. So taken across all cohorts and both Leucaena types, we're talking about an average of 0.61 kilograms per day over a 12-month period. So that's about 220 kilos of live weight gain per year. And when you factor in the increased stocking rate, it's in the order of 3 to 4 times the productivity you'd expect from a native pasture in that environment. So how did the heavyweight steers go at the end of this period? So here we have the track of their live weight from when they were introduced in, I think it was the 1st of March, and they were on the trial until early August when they were sold for slaughter. So they were bought in about an average of 510 kilos, and they put on an average of 103 kilos in 138 days. They were Brangus cross steers, and that's an ADG of 0.75 kilograms per day. Again, a very impressive result, although for those of you who remember, 2022 was a pretty good year with rainfall received out of season really right through. So we kept the Leucaena at that site more productive than it would normally have been in a normal year. So just moving on from the performance of Leucaena, is there any quirks about, to skip the slide, quirks about establishment that are specific to North Queensland? Well, not really. I mean, the same principles apply as anywhere as far as establishment is concerned. You need to establish Leucaena on the best soils that you have on your property, and in general terms, they are deep soils, they are as fertile soils as possible, and free draining. In North Queensland, in order of probably increasing potential, we've got alluvial soils that are suited to that. Problem is we don't have many areas that are cleared already, so there's some areas of cleared alluvial soils. There's a greater area of cleared red earths available, probably about 5,000 hectares. They're nothing special, those red earths, because they're quite low in fertility, but they're good cropping soils. And people are establishing Leucaena on those soils, and they're the same soils that the Perennial trial was conducted on. And there are also soils on the coast, a mixed bag really, relatively speaking, less potential there, and they range from quite handy good soils to pretty ordinary soils. And then finally we have the basalts, and there's a very large area of potential there because they are high in phosphorus, but they have the complication generally of being treed, so you'd only be looking to plant Leucaena where the trees were fairly light, and they're also rocky. So they bring extra management challenges, and we wouldn't recommend people plant Leucaena on those soils without considering that beforehand. Now, as far as actual establishment is concerned, no different to anywhere else. You need really good attention to weed control in the lead up to planting, and then in the 3 or 4 months post-planting. So we can see good examples in this bottom left photo here of Leucaena being planted into a prepared strip on an alluvial soil, and then Leucaena germinating on a nice weed-free seedbed on the coast. And the bottom photo shows what happens when you don't get the weed control right. So for whatever reason here, I would say herbicide application has been missed or has run out, and the Leucaena there has really struggled compared to the adjacent rows that were planted at the same time. The other thing to note is that we tend to plant in strips in North Queensland. Most growers don't go to the trouble of cultivating the whole paddock, which has been common practice in central Queensland. Because Leucaena is established in conjunction with the wet season, moisture is not usually a limiting factor during establishment, so we don't see excess competition from the grasses in the interrow. There's a few people who do go to the trouble of cultivating the whole paddock when they're looking to re-establish an improved pasture in conjunction with Leucaena. So establishment is during the wet season from about New Year until about now. Late February is about the cut-off, and it's getting too late beyond this time. On the coast, however, it's too wet during the wet season, so people tend to establish in the shoulder season months from sort of April to June. And we always say to people that only establish what you can manage well, so better to establish in bite-sized chunks and do it well than do a poor job on larger areas, especially when you don't have the experience. The common question is whether to plant single or double rows, and my answer is there's no right or wrong way. It's really what you prefer, what gear you might have. If you're uncertain, talk to people in the area that have Leucaena and get their take on it. I mean, there's probably, traditionally single rows were planted originally. They're probably easier to prune in the long term. More recently, there's been the trend to planting double rows. And the reasons being that if for some reason you get a bit of poor establishment in one of the double rows, then the gaps are filled with the other row. But you also get this competition between Leucaena, which keeps it smaller for longer and less woody. And in this case, you can see how the two rows grow away from each other, forming a sort of a vase shape, and this makes access to cattle a little easier. So is redlands worth it? Has it been worthwhile? Is it worthwhile producers planting redlands, considering it is more expensive to buy? As I pointed out previously, we didn't see any advantage from planting redlands at Penariti, but that was because we didn't have any significant psyllid population there during the whole time of the 4 years of grazing. So in the photos on the left there, however, during the establishment phase, we had Leucaenas psyllids at the site in significant numbers for a month or two. I think these photos are taken in May. So in the top photo there, you can see redlands looking pretty healthy, whereas in the bottom photo, in the adjacent paddock, separated only by a barbed wire fence, is one of the grows looking pretty sick. Now, the wander grows did bounce back from that because the psyllid population reduced and we didn't really see them again. We also know from growers who planted fairly large areas of Leucaena in slightly wetter environments not far from Perennial, they've used redlands and they've successfully gone ahead with Leucaena using redlands, whereas in the past they had tried other varieties of Leucaena and it was just a waste of time because they were continually damaged by psyllid attacks, so it just wasn't worthwhile. So redlands does have a clear advantage in psyllid-prone areas. The story on the coast, however, and the Atherton tablelands is a little more complicated because we have seen psyllids attack redlands in those areas and cause some damage. And then you have the added factor in those environments that you've already got very productive pastures in many cases. And we don't have any live weight gain data from people growing Leucaena in those areas, any reliable live weight gain data. So we can't really say, is the cost benefit of adapting Leucaena or redlands in those areas worth it, especially when you factor in the psyllid issue. It's just one of the challenges I wanted to raise with Leucaena in the north. I think it's also an issue in central Queensland, and I was going to call this the problem of too much Leucaena, but anyone who's had any experience with Leucaena would say, I think, that there are certain times of the year when you can't have enough Leucaena. So it's probably the wrong way to frame it. I think it's better stated that it's the problem of underutilisation of Leucaena. And it arises because in the wet season in the north, we get really vigorous growth of Leucaena at a time when the inter-row pasture is usually doing well and the cattle prefer grazing the inter-rows. So you get this sort of runaway growth and in a short time you get a lot of Leucaena that's out of reach of the cattle, and so you're in a sense wasting it. And then it gets to a state where you have to bring it all back under control again with some kind of expensive mechanical intervention. And so this image sort of exemplifies this situation where we've had Leucaena that started the wet season already quite big. And in this case, I think this Leucaena was probably only 4 years old. So it's already quite big and it has been grazed during that time. So we did a little thing here of cutting back some of that Leucaena, and that was in the week before Christmas. And that growth you see there, which is already overhead high up, is what's occurred in less than 6 weeks. So even though that was locked away from cattle, had a whole paddock look like that, and the cattle had been there, I don't think it would have looked much different. So moving forward, producers are already in North Queensland, and I understand in Central Queensland as well, generally adopting wider row spacings to address this issue, because the issue becomes one of spiral downwards to, a poorer inter-row pasture, so less grass. You open up gaps, you get volunteer Leucaena in those areas. So by adopting wider row spacings, the thought is, well, you'll get better utilisation of Leucaena. And this is something we hope to investigate in the next few years at Perennial, whereby we'll implement a combination of some wider row spacing by taking out every second row in some of the paddocks there. We'll compare that to other paddocks where we'll implement a regime of more frequent light cutting instead of cutting the Leucaena right down to nothing, letting it regrow. Perhaps annual light cutting to keep it in the zone of cattle grazing. And it's also about managing your grazing, rotational grazing, putting fences in so that you can do short duration intensive grazing should help that situation and let the inter-row pasture recover. And I also think, just to sum up, that there's a case for a new variety of Leucaena that in a sense is just as productive as the existing varieties, but it's a dwarfing variety. So it's a small variety that doesn't grow as tree-like as our existing varieties. So I'll hand over now, Greg. That's all I've got to say. I mean, obviously people have more specific questions about Leucaena and Leucaena establishment than what I'm able to cover today. So, we're obviously available to be talked to on an individual basis.
Thank you very much. I'm going to present some work that we undertook within the MLA co-funded project Feeding Leucaena to Manage the Rumen for Maximum Beef Profit. And I want to, at the outset, acknowledge my team, the Microbial Ecology Group, who did the work that I'm presenting. So, Leucaena, with its high protein levels and its palatability as a browse plant, the modelling work of Marie Bowen and Fred Chudley showed that Leucaena pasture grazing is the most profitable system for fattening steers. And from what Craig showed, it seems to be that's very true. Under typical grazing conditions, Leucaena may contribute up to 40% of the dry matter intake in the diet of animals. And Cyro's work has shown it can potentially reduce methane emissions by up to 20%. There's been a number of varieties of Leucaena released in Australia over the years. Cunningham and Wondergrays are the most widely planted at present, but it is expected that redlands will become more widely planted in the more humid regions. So why are toxin-munching microbes important? It's mainly because Leucaena has a little problem. All varieties of Leucaena contain the non-protein amino acid mimosine in all parts of the plant, and this can cause toxicity in ruminant livestock. If the animal absorbs the mimosine, it interferes with the way the thyroid utilises iodine, and it inhibits the production of the growth-regulating hormone thyroxine, resulting in goiter. In the rumen, there's a lot of bacteria naturally occurring which can break down mimosine, but it's broken down to its immediate secondary metabolite, which is a compound called 3,4-dihydroxypyridine, or 3,4-DHP, and that, if it can be broken down, it can be further degraded to an isomer, 2,3-DHP. Each of these compounds are toxic if absorbed by the animal, and it's not until all of them have been completely broken down into non-toxic metabolites that the effects of toxicity are neutralized. When Leucaena was first considered as a forage for grazing cattle in the 50s and 60s, the animals didn't have rumen bacteria that were able to completely neutralize the toxins. And so animals would present with symptoms of Leucaena toxicity. And those signs include the loss of the tail switch, which you can see in the picture of the animal here, hair loss, listlessness, appetite loss, and poor growth. So how was this little problem in Leucaena overcome? I'm going to do a very brief potted history of how it was overcome. In 1983, an enriched rumen-based culture from Hawaiian goats, which had been seen to be eating Leucaena with no signs of toxicity, was brought into Australia. This was eventually put into cattle at the DAF's Anoomba Secure facility and then into cattle at Cyro's Lansdowne Research Station. And these cattle were used in experimental grazing trials and found to be able to safely graze Leucaena without showing any clinical signs of toxicity. The late Ray Jones and his team at Cyro showed that it was a specific species of bacteria that was breaking down the DHP toxins, and this bacteria was isolated and named Synergistes jonesii. In the late 80s, the DAF inoculant was actually sourced from fistulated steers that were grazing Leucaena at the Bryan Pastures Research Station. And if you wanted the inoculant, if you wanted the drench, you rang up, they went and got some rumen fluid out of the animal, put it on ice and sent it to you. In the 1990s, DAF started using an in vitro fermentation system instead of animals to produce a mixed bacterial inoculum. And the fermentations were originally started using rumen fluid from the Bryan pasture steers, and they were fed chopped up leaf material from the Leucaena cultivar Cunningham. We still are making the inoculum in my lab in the fermenter system you see in the picture. And we run the fermenter for 30 days, and throughout it we do some quality checks. We set up toxin degradation assays where we take the populations out of some fluid out of the fermenter, and we spike it with each of the 3 different toxins. And then we subsample at time 0, time 48, and time after a week of incubation. And we look for the toxin using high-performance liquid chromatography. And what we're looking for is it disappearing and being broken down. We also take daily samples and use molecular techniques to look at detecting and the numbers of the bacteria Synergistes jonesii present in the inoculum. In 2018, MLA co-funded this project, a project to determine the effect of the anti-psyllid compounds present in redlands on the Leucaena inoculum's bacterial populations and its ability to detoxify the 3 toxins. And we did this through a series of in vitro fermentations. The fermentations were conducted in the same way we did to produce the inoculum. We used cryopreserved DAF Leucaena inoculum to start them, but the difference was that the fermentations were fed chopped leaf from either Redlands, Wonder Greys or Cunningham. Everything else was the same, the daily samples, the toxin degradation assays that we did. We also harvested the fermentation fluid and cryopreserved it at the end of the 30-day fermentation. What we found was that Redlands in particular knocked the populations of Synergistes jonesii around quite significantly at the beginning. The graphs on the left are the daily population numbers of S. jonesii, and the black line with the diamonds is the average number of S. jonesii in the daily samples of Cunningham-fed fermentations, and the other 2 are 2 fermentations we did feeding Redlands leaf. What you can see is the numbers of S. jonesii dip at the beginning. It doesn't look terribly impressive on the top graph, but it's a logarithmic scale. So what I've done in the bottom graph is we've set Cunningham as 100%, and what you can see is the numbers drop to less than 10% of what is normally found in the fermenter. And it took between 6 to 12 days for the populations to recover. And in the toxin degradation assays, the Redlands was able to break down the mimosine, which we expected. They were able to break down the 2,3-DHP, but it wasn't breaking down the 3,4-DHP right across the fermenter, not completely. This concerned us about what would happen with the populations if the inoculum was used in animals grazing Leucaena. So we decided to take the fermenter fluid we took at the end of the run from the feeding Redlands, and we started it, used it to start another fermentation fed Redlands leaf. We were able to use the microbial populations of one fermentation to feed into another and allow them time to adapt and improve the fermentation each time. We ended up with cultivar adapted inoculums for both Redlands and Wonder Greys and Cunningham. But the problem is there's just not enough demand to make cultivar specific inoculums worthwhile doing, because it takes quite a lot of time and manpower. So we decided to try a different approach. What we did was we took the microbes from the individual cultivar adapted fermentations, and we combined them into a single fermentation, which we fed chopped leaf from the 3 cultivars, and we called this fermentation the trimix fermentation. We then actually harvested that and cryopreserved it, and we did further fermentations where we took it back and fed it individual cultivar leaf material. We also continued on with the trimix into more trimix fermentations to further adapt its capabilities within that system, being fed the 3 different cultivar leaves. What we found, this again, the graph on the left is the daily populations of S. jonesii. The black is again the average numbers that we see we were seeing in the Cunningham-fed fermentations, and you can see the original trimix. It did dip, but it did recover. The red line with the the trimix is the purple with the triangles in both graphs, and the red with the squares was when we took it back and fed it Redlands. And what we found was when we did the original trimix feeding it Redlands, it did detoxify the 3,4 over a week, but not completely. When we did the trimix adaptation, it was detoxifying the 3,4 quite successfully within the 48 hours. And subsequently, we have taken it back to Redlands, and it was detoxifying that within the 48 hours. So we were happy that the trimix fermentation could be used to produce the Leucaena inoculum suitable for putting into animals grazing psyllid-resistant cultivars. But do we need to? With Leucaena having been in Queensland as a Leucaena pasture grazing system for 40 years, do the Queensland cattle already possess rumen bacteria capable of degrading the Leucaena toxin? It's been a question that we've been asked over the more recent years. So we decided to investigate this. We we got animal ethics approval. We set up a experimental design where we would go to up to 20 properties across Queensland, sampling around 5 animals per property. And we had 4 different categories we were looking at. Cattle 1, which was cattle that had never been inoculated but grazed Leucaena. 2 was cattle that had received rumen fluid from the Syro or DPI cattle, so pre-1993. 3 was cattle that had been inoculated with the DAF inoculum, were grazing Leucaena. And 4 was naive cattle that had never been exposed to Leucaena and never received the DAF inoculum. We actually set up a mobile lab. We got a lithium-ion battery that could run incubators. The little white box there is our 39-degree incubator. We had 2 of them. We had an inverter that allowed us to have a little centrifuge. We could spin samples and process samples, and we had a portable freezer. So we'd go on property. We would collect data from the producers about their management system, their Leucaena variety, the cattle inoculation status, etc. We would sample rumen fluid, and we would immediately set it up into our toxin degradation assays, adding each of the toxins, 3 toxins, into the tubes. We would incubate it and take the samples, and then take them, store them, and take them back to the lab. We visited a total of 14 properties, and we had 3 from category 1, the uninoculated grazing Leucaena. We didn't get any from category 2. We got 7 from category 3, which was receiving the DAF inoculum, and we broke them into the circles were properties that herd had received the DAF inoculum, and the triangles were properties that I might have that the wrong way around, that had been inoculated previously and were being managed. And we had 4 properties from naive animals. And what we found was that cattle that have never been inoculated and that were grazing Leucaena, where they were able to completely detoxify in 48 hours the mimosine and the 2,3, but there was a number of properties that within 48 hours they had not really completely degraded the 3,4 DHP toxin, but after a week of incubation they had. The cattle that had been inoculated with the DAF inoculum, with the vast majority of the properties we went to were completely detoxifying all 3 toxins within 48 hours. We had Site C were managing their cattle by running new cattle in as the stock left the paddock. And when we went out to sample, they had an enormous feed base of lush green paddock, and we weren't certain how much the animals were actually eating of the Leucaena. But the naive cattle were interesting. They could break down the mimosine, which we knew naive cattle could do, but the vast majority of the ones that we sampled were not breaking down either the 3,4 or the 2,3. There was no change at all in the levels across the week of the assay. We did have one site that had a couple of animals that were able to partially detoxify the 3,4 within a week of incubation, and a couple of them were able to detoxify the 2,3 as well. So our conclusions from the work is that we've moved the production of the DAF Leucaena inoculum to a trimix fermentation, which is what you'll get now if you buy it. We also found that Queensland cattle do not naturally possess rumen bacteria capable of degrading the Leucaena DHP toxins. Uninoculated cattle do detoxify, but they partially degrade within 48 hours, and there's concerns about flow out of the rumen and absorption by the animal in that time. But the majority of the cattle receiving the DAF inoculum could completely degrade all the toxins within 48 hours. So our recommendation to industry is that there are benefits of rumen drenching with the DAF inoculum to provide your cattle with grazing Leucaena with rumen bacteria that can completely degrade all the toxins to ensure you get the maximum benefits out of grazing your Leucaena. And Greg, that's my last slide, so I'll hand back over to you.